there exists a photograph that, for a fleeting moment in 1918, captured the imagination of an entire nation. But the woman in that photograph? She would fade into obscurity almost as quickly as she arrived. Her name was Verna Erikson, and her story begins not with triumph, but with a single frame frozen in time, a moment that would define her legacy far more than the life she actually lived. Picture this. It's spring, 1918. Finland is burning. Not literally, though the flames of civil war have already begun to consume the country. A young woman, barely into her 20s, walks through the streets of Helsinki with an impossible burden strapped across her body. 3 bandoliers of ammunition crisscross her chest like the pattern on a deadly tapestry. At her side hangs a large pistol, a weapon that, in her hands, carries more symbolic weight than practical purpose. She is carrying hundreds of rounds of ammunition, their weight pressing against her shoulders as she moves through the city. When that photograph was taken, nobody knew it would become iconic. Nobody knew it would be splashed across the cover of Suomen Kuvalehti, Finland's leading weekly magazine, on June 15, 1918. But let's not jump ahead. Let's understand who she was and why her frozen image in that photograph would become so powerful that it would overshadow everything else she ever did or ever could have done. Because here's the thing about Verna Erikson. She lived 25 years on this earth, but history has only ever remembered that 1 year, that one moment, that one photograph. Everything before it seems to disappear into shadow. Everything after it never had the chance to exist. To understand Verna Erikson, we must first understand Helsinki in 1918. And Helsinki in 1918 was not the peaceful, orderly city we might imagine today. It was a place teetering on the very edge of catastrophe. Finland had declared its independence from Russia just months earlier, in December 1917, after more than a century under Russian rule. When the Russian Empire collapsed during its own revolution, Finland saw an opportunity, but independence would not be handed over peacefully. It would have to be fought for, literally. By early 1918, the country was splitting apart at the seams. On one side, the White Guard, mostly representing the middle class, the educated, the landowners, and those who feared the spread of socialism. On the other, the Reds, workers, socialists, and those who believed that independence should also mean social revolution. Helsinki itself became a battleground. Streets that had been perfectly ordinary became killing fields. Neighborhoods transformed into fortresses, and ordinary people like Verna Erikson had to make impossible choices. The question facing young, educated Finns in 1918 was terrifyingly simple. Which side are you on? And more importantly, what are you willing to do about it? For Verna, the choice seemed clear. She was educated, a student at the Helsinki University of Technology, one of very few women enrolled there at the time. She came from a background that aligned with the white movement. But here's where Verna's story becomes remarkable. She didn't just passively support the white cause. She didn't attend meetings or make speeches. She took an active role. She became a courier and arms smuggler. Think about that for a moment. A young woman, probably no more than 5 feet 4 or 5 feet 5, carrying ammunition and weapons through a war-torn city. The logistics alone are staggering. How many people had to help her? How many risks did she take? How many times did she nearly get caught? The photograph suggests she wasn't hiding. She was openly bearing arms as part of the White Guard's operations in Helsinki, but photographing her, publishing her image, this was also a choice. It was propaganda, pure and simple. The White Guard wanted the world to see that even their women, their daughters, their students, were willing to take up arms for the cause. It was a powerful message. It was also, perhaps, deeply unfair to Verna Erikson. But who was Verna Erikson before she became the girl with the bandoliers? Who was she really? Born on April 11, 1893, Verna came of age in a Finland that was beginning to change. The feminist movement was stirring. Women were entering universities and professions previously closed to them. Education was no longer a privilege reserved only for men. Verna Erikson was part of this new wave. She was one of the few women at the Helsinki University of Technology, an institution that, even today, remains largely male-dominated. In 1918, it was almost entirely so. And yet, there she was. We don't know much about her family background. The records that survive don't tell us what her parents did, or what they thought of their daughter's involvement in the Civil War. We don't know whether she was encouraged to participate or acted against their wishes. We don't know if she had siblings, or if they shared her political convictions. Those details, the intimate fabric of her life, have been lost to time. What we do know is this: she was intelligent enough to gain admission to one of Finland's most prestigious technical institutions. She was brave enough, or perhaps convinced enough, to become actively involved in a dangerous conflict. And she was visible enough in her community that her photograph was considered important enough to publish on the cover of a national magazine. The photograph shows a young woman with a steady gaze. There's no smile, no attempt to charm the camera. Just a direct, unflinching look. Is that determination in her eyes? Conviction? Or something else? Uncertainty masked by duty? We'll never know. The photograph preserves her image, but reveals almost nothing about her inner world. By June of 1918, when that photograph was published, the Finnish Civil War had already ended. The White Guard had won. The Reds had been defeated. The immediate threat had passed. But Helsinki was still reeling, still nursing its wounds. And Verna Erikson, at 25 years old, was about to discover that the war she had fought so hard for would take her life in an entirely different way. In the wake of the White victory, recognition came quickly. General Carl Gustaf Emil Mannerheim, Commander-in-Chief of the White Forces and soon to be Finland's central political figure, had an idea. He wanted to create a new military order, something that would honor those who had sacrificed for Finland's independence and for the white cause. The Order of the Cross of Liberty was established in 1918, founded on Mannerheim's initiative. To understand what Verna Erikson's participation in the Civil War meant, we need to look at what women were doing during the conflict more broadly. And this is where things become even more striking. The Finnish Civil War, despite its brutality, was unusual in how many women took part. In most early 20th century wars, women were restricted to nursing or support roles. But in Finland, women had already achieved remarkable political visibility. In 1906, Finnish women had gained both the right to vote and the right to stand for election, making Finland the first country in Europe to grant full political rights to women. This early political empowerment helped create a culture in which women were viewed as legitimate social and political actors. So when war came in 1918, it wasn't surprising that women would again step forward. Some, like Verna, served as couriers and logistics operatives for the Whites. Others worked as nurses or in intelligence. And a few, such as Salme Setälä, who was later decorated alongside Verna, became notable enough to be recognized by the new Finnish state. Yet even with this participation, society remained fundamentally patriarchal. Women's contributions, while occasionally celebrated, were often framed through their relationship to men, as daughters protecting their father's nation, as wives and fiancées supporting their soldiers. Rarely were they described as independent actors with their own convictions and agency. Verna Erikson's photograph demonstrates this tension perfectly. Yes, she was being honored, but the caption that accompanied her image emphasized her femininity. Miss E, the language of protection and nurture. She wasn't described as a soldier or operative. She was described as a protectress, a word that carried very specific connotations. It emphasized gentleness and guardianship, even as it acknowledged her role in warfare. This framing, while meant to honor, also limited how Verna could be understood. She wasn't just a person conducting dangerous wartime operations. She was a woman conducting dangerous wartime operations, and the gender qualifier was placed front and center. Her novelty became the story, sometimes more than her actions themselves. Let's talk about why that photograph was published in the first place, because it didn't appear in the magazine by accident. Nothing appears on the cover of a national magazine by accident, especially not during a time of national crisis. By June 1918, when the photograph was published, the Finnish Civil War had already ended. The white forces had won. The outcome was no longer in question. So why would the white leadership allow, or perhaps encourage, the publication of a photograph showing one of their operatives carrying ammunition through the city? The answer is simple: propaganda. The newly victorious whites were shaping the story of the war before it had even faded from memory. They wanted to show that their cause had been patriotic, moral, and justified, that it wasn't merely a conflict of class or ideology, but a fight for national survival. The image of Verna Erikson served that purpose perfectly. Here was a young woman, educated, respectable, and clearly from a good family, carrying weapons for the white cause. She was proof that the struggle for independence had been so righteous, so necessary, that even women, the ones traditionally associated with peace and protection, had taken up arms. It was powerful symbolism, and it worked. The photograph circulated. It became iconic. It represented to many the white victory and the purity of the national cause, but it also served another purpose. It reframed the war. Instead of appearing as a brutal civil conflict that had pitted Finn against Finn, the whites could point to Verna Erikson and others like her as evidence that their fight had been something higher, something noble. This is the nature of propaganda, of course. It takes real people and real events and reshapes them to fit a narrative. Verna Erikson became part of that narrative. She was real, but she was also a symbol. And once the symbol existed, it took on a life of its own. Verna Erikson's photograph became one of the most enduring images of the white victory. It was reprinted in books, articles, and later exhibitions. For many Finns, even decades later, it came to stand for courage, sacrifice, and devotion to the homeland. But the woman behind that image remained largely unknown. Verna Erikson died on October 16, 1918, just a few months after the Civil War ended. She was only 25 years old. Her death came at a strange time. Finland had finally achieved independence, and peace had returned, at least outwardly. Yet the country was still fractured by the memories and wounds of civil war. Verna's passing, in some sense, became part of that same moment of national transition. A generation trying to move forward, even as the cost of freedom was still being counted. She was buried in Haetaniemi Cemetery in Helsinki, among others who played their part in shaping the new Finnish state. In the aftermath of the war, Finland struggled to heal. The divisions between the Reds and Whites didn't disappear overnight. Thousands had died, and the bitterness lingered for years. The country's leaders sought ways to create unity, and the stories they chose to tell about the war mattered. Images like Verna's were essential to that process. They allowed the public to see the conflict through a single unifying lens, that of patriotic sacrifice. They provided a face for heroism, particularly a feminine one, that could transcend the politics of the era. But that symbolic power came at a cost. Verna Erikson, the person, was gone. What remained was Verna Erikson, the idea, the young woman who had carried bullets for the nation, the face of the white struggle. Her humanity was replaced by mythology. The Finland that emerged from 1918 was shaped by the trauma of civil war, and by the need to create a shared national identity. The new republic wanted to look forward, to see itself not as a land divided by ideology, but as a people united by sacrifice and endurance. Images like the one of Verna Erikson were central to that effort. They offered a visual shorthand for patriotism. They allowed a fractured nation to imagine itself whole again through a single, powerful image, a young woman who had risked everything for her country's freedom. Over time, the person in the photograph became less known than the image itself. Generations of Finns saw the picture without necessarily knowing her name. It appeared in schoolbooks, exhibitions, and later in digital archives, often captioned simply as White Guard Woman or Protectress of the Fatherland. Her image became a symbol of Finnish heroism, an embodiment of self-sacrifice and national resolve. But behind that symbol was a real person. Verna Erikson was not a mythic figure. She was a 25-year-old student, intelligent and determined, who took extraordinary risks in extraordinary times. She studied technology when few women could. She acted when many might have stayed hidden. She died only months after the photograph that made her famous was published. Her life cut short by illness rather than war. Her photograph has endured for more than a century, but her voice has not. The details of her life, her studies, her family, her friendships, remain almost entirely unknown. The archives preserve the image, but not the person. This is a particular kind of loss. It's not the destruction of monuments or the erasure of dates. It's the quiet fading of individuality beneath national myth. When history turns someone into a symbol, it often strips away the nuances that made them human. Verna Erikson became a vessel for meanings others placed upon her: courage, purity, sacrifice, patriotism. Each generation reinterpreted her according to its needs. During the interwar years, her image represented the heroism of Finland's independence struggle. After World War II, it was revisited in a more subdued light, less triumphalist, more reflective. In contemporary Finland, it appears in exhibitions about women's roles in conflict, about propaganda, and about how nations remember. Through all these retellings, the photograph has retained its power. It is both intimate and political, personal and collective. The bandoliers crossing her chest are heavy with symbolism: the merging of youth and war, education and sacrifice, femininity and defiance. Yet perhaps the most striking thing is how ordinary she looks. No uniform beyond the bandoliers, no staged backdrop. Just a young woman standing in a moment of upheaval, steady and unflinching before the camera. In that sense, her photograph is less about war than about witness. It captures a generation on the edge of transformation, the moment when Finland became independent, and when its citizens, women included, were called to define what that independence meant. Verna Erikson's life ended on October 16, 1918, but her image continues to speak, silently, across time. It reminds us that nations are built not only by generals and politicians, but by students, messengers, and ordinary people who find themselves in extraordinary circumstances. And it reminds us, too, of how easily an individual story can be consumed by collective memory. The photograph that made Verna Erikson famous gave her a kind of immortality, but it also ensured that the living, breathing person would be remembered mostly through a single frozen moment. Her face, her steady gaze, her ammunition-crossed chest, all of it became Finland's story, not just her own. More than a century later, the woman with the bandoliers still looks out from that photograph, her eyes fixed on something far beyond the frame. We cannot know what she saw that day, but we know what she came to represent: the cost of freedom, the fragility of memory, and the power of an image to outlive the life it once contained.